Hello. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you about a specific way to design PowerPoint slides called the Assertion-Evidence Approach. One important thing I want to emphasize is that the principles I'm going to tell you about are based on research. So the middle book, the Cambridge Handbook of Multimedia Learning, contains the results of many psychological studies on how people learn from multimedia that have been organized into a theory called the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. I won't get into all the specifics here though. The book on the left, The Craft of Scientific Presentations, is the basis for this presentation about the Assertion-Evidence Approach. So the creator of it, Michael Alley, he wrote this book and he actually got an NSF grant to study how people learn from scientific presentations. And although the focus is scientific, I think this approach applies to many different disciplines actually. And then the book on the right, Presentation Zen, is one that I actually started out reading to get into this concept of presentation design, and it's a really interesting one for you to get ideas of different ways to design slides that are really visually impactful. So the problem with typical PowerPoint design is that the way people design slides has too much information on them usually. So especially when you're talking over a slide like the ones on the screen here, there's so much information that people are reading visually, they're listening to you verbally, and neither is happening very effectively. PowerPoint itself contributes to this problem because of the way it's set up as a default. But don't let PowerPoint tell you what to do. You can change the format of your slides so it's title only, which is what I recommend, and then just removing that middle box altogether. So getting into the assertion evidence approach specifically, what we're looking for is a slide that contains a message headline and then visual evidence below it that's supporting that message. So in the example on this slide, the photos of the dog are the visual evidence, and then the sentence at the top is the message headline, or the assertion. So when you're implementing the assertion evidence approach, the first step is to write out your sentence headline. So you're focusing on creating slides that are just around one concept, and then you write out a sentence that summarizes that concept. So Michael Alley and his colleagues, they studied specifically what the sentence should be like actually. So they say very specifically that the headline should be a sentence, not a phrase like we'd usually write in a PowerPoint. They actually recommend 28-point font, but what they're using, because it's a little bit older, are the old 4:3 slides. So the slides where you would have the black bars on the side of the screen. But since now we can make widescreen slides, I actually recommend using font that's about 32-point, which is what I'm using in this presentation. They also recommend specifically to left justify it, which is different, right? Because we're used to centering text. And then just capitalize the first letter like you would a sentence. And they even go so far as to specifically say you can choose whether you want to put a period at the end or not. So the main thing to consider about font is that it shouldn't distract your audience. So in the examples I have on this slide, Comic Sans and Papyrus, those are no-nos in presentation design. Actually, in fonts in general, avoid using those. They are so much of a joke in the design community that someone actually developed a font called Comic Papyrus, combining the two worst fonts out there. So don't use those. The other two on the slide, Seago Print and Brush Script, those are just fonts that are harder to read, so I recommend not using those. In this presentation, I'm using Helvetica, which is a very trendy font right now. The assertion evidence approach, they say you can just use good old Calibri, which is the default in PowerPoint. So moving on to the second step of the assertion evidence approach, once you have your headline written in sentence format, the next step is to find or create some visual evidence that backs up your point. So in the example I have on this slide, the assertion is about the xenon headlights, and then the visual evidence is an example of a halogen headlight and an example of a xenon headlight. So that's perfect, right? So this is the ideal application of the assertion evidence approach. On this slide, I'm just showing you another example of the assertion evidence approach. So as you can see, the assertion is a sentence at the top, and then we have the visual evidence backing that up below. So one of the most important things I want to emphasize in this presentation is that people learn better when there is a graphic included with words. So we normally design PowerPoints with words, and more words. So it's very important to include graphics that back up your concept as often as possible. So as you start implementing the assertion evidence approach, you might find that it's difficult to find images sometimes. So you might think, well, That presentation, I learned I'm supposed to include an image, so I'll put in something decorative to take up some space on the slide. But definitely don't do that. It's very rare that there should actually be kittens in a presentation that you're designing that someone's going to be learning from. So avoid decorative images because they distract people and they can negatively impact learning. Now, this is something that a lot of people struggle with. Try not using design templates when you design your presentations. So as you can see through the one that I'm showing you, I'm not using a design template. It's just a white background with text and images. Now, if I didn't have images in my presentation, that would be really boring. So I know sometimes people think, well, it looks like I'm not trying if I don't use some kind of design template. But what you find when you start implementing more images is that they actually start taking up or covering up the design template in the background. So one thing people find when they start using the assertion evidence approach is that they use more slides than they had in the past. So I think more slides is a good thing. Here's an example of a typical PowerPoint slide. So we have 4 different concepts on here at least. What I'd recommend is instead making at least 5 different slides out of that slide. So this helps your audience stay on track better when they're following along with you. Whereas if you're using the slide on the right side, you may talk for 10 minutes and then your audience will lose track of where you're at. But if you break things down into smaller slides, then you can have 1 concept per slide, 1 sentence assertion, and then a graphic that's supporting it, and your audience isn't going to forget which one you're on. Now, when some people move to the assertion evidence approach, they think, well, I use the PowerPoint slides to keep myself on track, so what am I going to do when there's less text on the slide? And an important thing to consider in presentation design is that your slides are to help your audience learn and follow your message better, and they're not actually for you to use as a teleprompter. So what you can do, as in the image on this slide, is include some notes at the podium, perhaps. If you're recording something for online, you can use the notes section of your PowerPoint slides. So if your PowerPoint's in presenter mode, you can see the notes there. And again, when you start to break down your slides into shorter, smaller concepts, that can actually help you stay on track better too. So in the assertion evidence approach, what they actually recommend, and they specifically state it this way, that you should fashion sentences on the spot. So instead of reading or memorizing your audio narration to go along with your slides, instead you should be speaking extemporaneously off the top of your head rather than something that you've specifically prepared to read. So in this part of the presentation, I'll focus on the visual evidence aspect of the assertion evidence approach, since that can be challenging to implement. Of course, Google is full of images, so that can be a good place to find them. That would probably be your go-to, right? Unfortunately, copyright exists, so we need to be conscientious of that when developing presentations, to use copyright-free images, even if it's an educational environment. Fair use can be interpreted in multiple ways, but the best way to go about it is to find images that are licensed for reuse. So there are search tools and then usage rights that you can set in your search preferences. Now, an important distinction, sometimes people think that if they cite an image, that means that they're complying with copyright, but no, actually that just protects against plagiarism. So it's important to still find images that are copyright acceptable and then cite them regardless. So one nice way to present your visual evidence is through a chart or a graph. And that's ideal because you can make these yourself, either right in PowerPoint or you can use Excel to produce them as well. Since smartphones take such high quality photos, that's another way to find the visual evidence yourself and not have to worry about copyright. There's plenty of sites out there with images. So Pexels and Pixabay I found are 2 pretty good ones that have free images. But then Shutterstock and iStock, those have awesome images, but unfortunately you have to pay quite a bit for the ones that you find there. So some of the images that you find out there might have a watermark on them, like the example on the left, that's the watermark from the iStock photo site. So definitely don't use those. And then the one on the right, that's just an example of a low quality image. So if you find something that is a really nice image, but if you make it bigger, it gets pixelated, then just keep it small. Or if it's too pixelated, like this one on the slide, then just don't use it. So if you have a really nice high quality image like the one that I have on this slide, try to make that full screen. You can actually do right click and then send to back, and then you can put your text on top of it. So in this example, the back of the computer screen is a really nice place for me to put text. So that's a nice way to provide more visual impact. And then here's just an example of how this could traditionally be done if you were making the usual PowerPoint slides, right? Center text and then a small image in the middle. So it's just more visually interesting to make it full screen. So to wrap up the presentation, I just want to recap. Make sure that when you're creating your PowerPoint slides that you have a sentence assertion headline, and then add your visual evidence below, and make sure each slide revolves around a single message or concept. If you'd like more information on the Assertion Evidence Approach, they have a website, just assertion-evidence.com. Thanks for watching.